Fender's Shanghai factory, which used to build nothing but entry-level Squiers, now runs a torrefaction oven 6 days a week, curing roasted maple necks for a guitar that retails for $400. Nobody at Fender issued a press release when that oven went in. No ribbon cutting, no announcement, just a new capability sitting quietly on a factory floor that used to only know how to build cheap. We've been tracking what that oven, and the 2 others just like it, are actually being used to build next. If you like content that traces where guitar manufacturing money actually goes, instead of repeating whatever the marketing page says, hit the subscribe button because it helps these videos reach the players who'd rather understand the industry than just buy into it. Squier started as an American string company before Fender bought the name in 1965. The name Leo Fender had already sold to CBS Musical Instruments when he left the company that year. The modern Squier brand launched in 1982, built at the Fujigen Gaki factory in Nagano, Japan, the same factory making Fender Japan instruments at the time. That lasted less than a decade. By the early 1990s, Squiers built in Korea were losing badly to competitors, offering better wood and more finish options at the same price, and the brand looked close to collapse. Fender's answer was to go cheaper still. In 1994, production shifted to a factory called Yako in Zhangzhou, China, about 300 kilometers from Hong Kong. Yako was headquartered in Taiwan, but built the guitars on the mainland, with early plant management brought over from the Taiwan side to get quality control up to spec. The first order landed in May of 1995, 2,000 Squier Stratocasters, built from wood stock that had already been sitting in the factory since late the year before. A second Chinese manufacturer, AXL, opened multiple plants of its own before the decade was out. By 2004, Fender had gone further still, opening a highly automated factory in Shanghai as a joint venture, the kind of investment a company doesn't make in a market it considers temporary. Indonesia joined the mix a few years after China did, largely through a manufacturer called Cor-Tek, the same company that would later become known to a different brand's fans simply as Cort. Cor-Tek actually started out building instruments in Korea before it ever touched Indonesia, meaning the same manufacturing group that helped sink the reputation of Korean-built Squiers in the early 90s spent the following decade rebuilding a reputation for precision somewhere else entirely, under a different country's flag and a different customer's badge. Cor-Tek's Indonesian plant now builds a huge share of the mid-tier Squiers sold worldwide, everything from the entry-level Sonic series up through the Affinity line. China and Indonesia ended up splitting the work rather than one replacing the other, with China increasingly handling the models that need more woodworking precision and Indonesia handling higher volume at the lower end. That was the story for 2 decades. China and Indonesia as the place Fender put its cheapest guitars, the models a beginner bought and eventually traded up and away from. It isn't the whole story anymore. The Squier Classic Vibe and Contemporary lines, both built in China, now carry features that used to be reserved for guitars 2 or 3 times their price. Roasted maple necks, solid hardwood bodies instead of the plywood that sank the Korean Squiers 30 years ago. Pricing on these models runs from around $400 to $600, closing in on the low end of Fender's own Mexican-built Player Plus series and the Player 2 series, which starts around $799, and industry coverage now routinely describes Chinese Squier production as a manufacturing hub for professional-grade instruments rather than a beginner category. The same factories that used to build the guitar you told your kid not to bother learning on are now building the guitar a working musician could gig with without apologizing for it. The roasted maple detail matters more than it sounds like it should. Torrefaction, heating a neck blank in a low oxygen environment until the wood's sugars caramelize, was a boutique luthier technique for most of its history. The kind of process a small shop charged a premium for because it needed an oven, a controlled atmosphere, and someone who understood exactly how long to leave the wood in before it turned brittle instead of stable. Getting that process onto a production line at Squier price points means a factory invested in temperature-controlled ovens and quality control tight enough to catch a batch that's overcooked before it becomes a warped neck in a customer's hands. That isn't the kind of investment a factory makes for a product line it expects to keep undercutting on price alone. It's the kind of investment a factory makes when it's angling to build something with a higher price tag attached to it. There's a third tier in this story that rarely gets mentioned next to Squier, and it's worth putting on the table because it shows what the top of the ladder still looks like. Fender's Corona, California plant still builds the American Ultra II Stratocaster and the rest of the American Original and American Professional lines, guitars that carry compound radius fretboards, noiseless pickup sets, and a price tag that starts around $2,000. Corona is the piece of the operation Fender has never touched, the flagship that justifies everything built underneath it. But a flagship only needs to exist at the very top of a lineup. Everything below Corona, the Ensenada-built Player and Player 2 series in particular, exists in the exact price bracket where a China-built Squier Classic Vibe is already competing on specs. That's the layer of the lineup with the least room left to defend on manufacturing quality alone, and it's also the layer tariffs hit hardest, since Ensenada production doesn't get the blanket exemption that fully USMCA qualifying goods receive. There's also a competitor forcing the math along from outside Fender's own lineup entirely. Thomann's house brand, Harley Benton, builds guitars across around 20 factories in China, Indonesia, and Vietnam at price points below even Squier's, and has spent the last several years earning a reputation among players for punching well above that price. Fender has responded to that pressure legally as much as commercially, securing a European ruling that protects the Stratocaster body shape itself and sending cease and desist letters to smaller builders using that outline. It's an odd position to hold at the same time as this manufacturing story is playing out. Fender is defending the shape of the guitar in court, while the origin of the wood and hardware inside that shape keeps drifting further from Corona every year. The shape turns out to be the part of the identity worth fighting for. Where the guitar actually gets built has been treated as negotiable for 3 decades already. Fender isn't the only legacy brand watching this happen, and it isn't even the first to let it happen. Gibson built its own Qingdao facility to produce Epiphone, including models like the Epiphone Les Paul Standard 50s, effectively training a Chinese manufacturing base that now also builds guitars nobody at Gibson controls at all. PRS took a different route, handing lines like the PRSSE Custom 24 to Cor-Tek's Indonesian plant, the same factory network Squier already uses, while keeping its core lineup built in Maryland. In both cases, a company built its reputation on American manufacturing prestige and then decided its second tier didn't need to share that address, and neither reputation collapsed for it. If anything, both brands used the savings to fund the flagship lines that still say Made in USA, which, under the 2021 MUSA labeling rule, now carries real legal weight, with per-violation penalties attached if a company mislabels country of origin. The rule didn't stop the offshoring, it just made the honesty around it mandatory. The obvious objection is that players would revolt against a Fender labeled Made in China, the way they haven't revolted against a Squier carrying the same label. That objection assumes the label carries more weight than the guitar underneath it, and the last decade of gear forums suggests otherwise. Reviewers who spent years insisting a Mexican-built Player Stratocaster couldn't compete with an American one have spent the last couple of years saying almost the same thing about the gap between Ensenada and Zhangzhou, except now they're the ones being told the gap has closed. Country of origin has turned out to be a much better predictor of price than of tone, and price is the variable Fender actually controls. None of this means Fender's next move is obviously toward China. In 2025, Moody's calculated that a 25% tariff on goods built at Fender's Ensenada, Mexico plant, stacked with a 10% tariff on anything built in China, would add $20 to $25 million in costs. That report came with 3 separate credit downgrades in a single cycle, taking Fender's corporate family rating from B2 to B3, and dropping its senior secured term loan rating all the way to CAA1. Moody's own language called the situation highly disruptive if the tariffs stayed in place for long. Fender's public response wasn't to lean further into China. It was to increase production in Indonesia instead, and by 2026, S&P Global was crediting Fender with gaining market share in low-end guitars, partly because competing brands were pulling back on Chinese imports to dodge the same tariff exposure Fender itself was trying to avoid. For a story about Fender turning to China, that's an inconvenient set of facts, and it's worth sitting with rather than explaining away. Tariffs aren't a fixed condition though, and the picture has already shifted twice within a single year. The 25% tariff on Mexican goods that worried Moody's in 2025 didn't survive intact. The United States Supreme Court struck it down in February of 2026, and it was replaced with a 10% Section 122 surcharge, a measure with a hard statutory limit of 150 days, expiring around mid-2026 unless Congress acts to extend it. Guitars and other goods that qualify under the USMCA rules of origin remain exempt from that surcharge entirely, which is a large part of why Fender leaned toward Indonesia and Mexico rather than China in the short term. China never got that kind of exemption. The effective tariff rate on Chinese goods, driven largely by Section 301 tariffs that have been layered and escalated over several years, has climbed past 33% this year, well above where it sat when Moody's ran its 2025 numbers, eating into whatever cost advantage China briefly held over Indonesian production. What doesn't expire on a statutory clock is the manufacturing capability China has already built. The same factories turning out roasted maple necks for a $400 Squier are the factories that would build a $500 Fender if the tariff math ever tips back in that direction. And trade policy has proven this year that it can move fast in both directions. Fender's own Executive Vice President of Product, Justin Norvell, went to Washington personally earlier in this cycle, alongside representatives from Gibson and NAMM, to argue against the tariffs that were making the math worse for all of them. Companies don't send their own product executives to lobby against tariffs on manufacturing capacity they consider disposable. They send them to protect options they intend to keep using. The caution shows up further down the supply chain too. Analyst guidance heading into this year expected dealers to stay careful about how much inventory they carried, citing a weak macroeconomic backdrop and softer discretionary spending on big-ticket items like guitars. That's not the kind of environment where a company launches an expensive new domestic tier. It's exactly the kind of environment where a company quietly tests how far an existing overseas line can be pushed upward before anyone outside the industry notices the shift, because the marketing cost of that move is close to zero, and the manufacturing cost savings are immediate. Squier already absorbed the reputational risk of being the budget name 3 decades ago. Whatever comes next doesn't have to spend that same currency twice. Weak consumer spending changes what counts as a safe bet, too. Launching a new American-made tier means committing to Corona's higher labor and material costs at exactly the moment dealers are already nervous about moving expensive inventory. Extending a tier that already exists in China or Indonesia doesn't require new tooling or new hiring, just a factory floor that has already been proving itself on smaller Fender lines for years. Between those two options, only one of them looks like a company being cautious with its money rather than ambitious with it. And caution has been the theme of Fender's public financial guidance for a while now. For anyone shopping in the $400 to $800 range right now, the practical result is already here: tariffs or no tariffs. The Squier Classic Vibe and Contemporary lines are proof that Chinese-built necks and bodies can already match what USMCA qualifying Mexican production offers, often at a lower price, before any tariff ever enters the picture. The label reading Fender instead of Squier is, at this point, mostly a decision about margin and brand tiering, not a decision about what the factories on the ground are capable of building. Gibson already proved a Chinese-built second tier can carry a legacy name without damaging it. A different rulebook applies at PRS, which proved the same thing works with an Indonesian factory instead. Squier has spent 30 years quietly proving both lessons at once. Under a badge, Fender was always comfortable spending less to protect. If this shift is coming, it probably won't announce itself with a press release calling it a downgrade. It will show up quietly, in a spec sheet listing a new country of origin for a Player Series model, or in an annual report footnote about supplier concentration shifting a few percentage points further toward Asia, the same way the roasted maple necks arrived on $400 Squiers without anyone at Fender holding a press conference about it. The playbook has never needed one. If you want more of these breakdowns, tracing exactly where your gear money goes instead of taking a spec sheet at its word, subscribe, because it's what keeps videos like this getting made instead of another marketing recap.